Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Part 5, The Sacred Scriptures from Facing the Sphinx by Marie L. Farrington. Chapter 4, The Sacred Scriptures. In contemplation, if a man begin with certainties, he will end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. Bacon. The highest honor we can pay to truth is to show our confidence in it and our desire to have it sifted and analyzed by how rough a process soever, as being well assured that it is that alone that can abide all tests, and which, like the genuine gold, will come out all the purer from the fiercer fire. Reverend Robert Taylor in Deigesis. Symbology is so thoroughly linked with mythology, whether ancient or archaic, that a knowledge of both is requisite to become conversant with the primitive way of conveying ideas. And as mythology was the origin of every religious tenet extant in the world, we will trace presently our own Christian doctrine back to its true source. There is a natural connection between all religions, and there is one also between all languages. Both are the result of cycles of evolution. They are the outgrowth of a primitive germ, lost in the night of time. To suppose that our Christian religion was the result of a special revelation with no reliable evidence to corroborate such an assertion is to build on a sandy foundation. No nation ever made such a pretense in antiquity except a hybrid race, the Jews, who, even in religious matters, were the old clothes men of the world. Whatever they gathered from the neighboring nations on cosmogony and theology does not show any real mark of improvement. The Orientalists, Egyptologists, and Assyriologists have discovered one by one every Hebraic legend which was claimed to be unique or original in the recovered documents of prehistoric races. The pious Sir William Jones concludes his Asiatic researches with the following sentences. Thus have I attempted to trace, with a confidence continually increasing as I advanced, a parallel between the gods adored in Greece, Italy, and India, but which was the original system and which the copy I will not presume to decide. I am persuaded, however, that a connection existed between the old idolatrous nations of Egypt, India, Greece, and Italy, long before the birth of Moses. The great Orientalist leaves the reader without expressing his own conclusion because, undoubtedly, too much light is hurtful to the eyes. The oldest religions in the world, known at present, are the Indian, Mazdean, and Egyptian. They were established on the same basis, as proven by their sacred scriptures, the Vedas of the Hindus, the Zend Avesta of the Parsees, the Book of the Dead, and the ritual of the Egyptians. And none can be understood without a previous knowledge of symbology. Then comes the Chaldean religion next. It is known generally under the disfigured phase of Sabaeism, as interpreted by archaeologists who have recovered the Book of Numbers, the Assyrian tiles, and 4 books belonging to the collection called, singularly enough, the Nabatean Agriculture. This last work allows us a faint glimpse into the realm of Chaldean philosophy. From the Egyptian and Babylonian systems, the Jews derived their Bible, which is undoubtedly the youngest scripture claiming divine inspiration if we accept the Quran or Book of God. The latter appeared last and had the best opportunity for plagiarism. The application of chronology to matters of faith is exhibited nowhere except in the Jewish Bible, and it does not redound to the credit of its authors. Anterior to King David's reign, there is no data of any reliable historian which confirms one single fact related in the Old Testament. The Jewish historian Josephus lived about 60 years after the date attributed to Jesus' apparition or incarnation on earth, and his works are constantly brought forward as authoritative. He sought vainly for the testimony of Egyptian authors to support the pretensions he advanced concerning the antiquity of the Hebrews. Not one of them has so much as mentioned the prodigies of Moses or held out the least glimpse of probability or coincidence to his romantic tale. The drowning of a pharaoh with his whole army would certainly have been recorded in the annals of a people that has left us so many imperishable mementos of its past. But not a single fact has ever been discovered among the historical relics of any of the Hebrew contemporaries, corroborating their historical Bible previous to Holy King David. The whole fable of Moses, however, is to be found in the Orphic verses sung in the orgies of Bacchus, as celebrated in Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, ages before such people as the Jews were known to be in existence. The Chaldean tablets give the allegorical description of creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, with the history of Moses. How can the Pentateuch be called a revelation? The Tower of Babel especially was a myth very widely spread, even in America, ages before the landing of the Spaniards. In a work translated by Fray Diego Duran in 1579 called History of New Spain and deposited in the Royal Library of Madrid, the version of it is, after they had raised it so high that it reached the sky, the Lord of the divine heights said to the inhabitants of heaven, "Have you noticed how the inhabitants of the earth have built such a high and superb tower to ascend here, because they are enticed hither by the beauty and brightness of the sun? Come, let us confound them, for it is not just that those who live on the earth and are in the flesh should mix with us." Instantly the inhabitants of the skies rushed from the four corners of the world and like lightning destroyed the building which men had raised, whereupon the terror-stricken giants were separated and scattered on all sides of the earth. Chapter 1, Volume 1. None better than the Jews knew that a hidden meaning was underlying the text of the first books of the Bible, for the keys to it are concealed in some secret philosophical works called the Kabbalah, which, like their theology, was nothing more than the Oriental philosophy plagiarized and remodeled to suit their own conceit. In the course of their ramblings into the adjacent countries of Egypt, Assyria, and Phoenicia, they could not help learning the tenets of the doctrines of those nations. One thing indeed, says the great ecclesiastical writer Mosheim, appears at first sight very remarkable, that the variety of religions and gods in the heathen world neither produced wars nor dissensions among the different nations. Certainly it did not, for learned men allege with the most convincing arguments that the principal deities of all the Gentiles resembled each other in their essential characters, and that their being worshipped under different names could not bring any confusion into mythology, since they were all derived from the same source, a fact demonstrated by symbology most conclusively. The various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world, says Gibbon, were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosophers as equally false, and by the magistrates as equally useful. Both the interests of the priests and the credulity of the people were sufficiently respected. In their writings and conversation, the philosophers of antiquity asserted the independent dignity of reason, but they resigned their actions to the commands of law and custom. Viewing with a smile of pity and indulgence the various errors of the vulgar, they diligently practiced the ceremonies of their fathers, devoutly frequented the temples of the gods, and sometimes, condescending to act a part on the theater of superstition, they concealed the sentiments of an atheist under the sacerdotal robe. Reasoners of such a temper were scarcely inclined to wrangle about their respective modes of faith or of worship. It was indifferent to them what shape the folly of the multitude might choose to assume, and they approached with the same inward contempt and the same external reverence to the altars of the Lydian, the Olympian, or the Capitoline Jupiter. Gibbon's elegant account of the matter is only partially true, for the very institution of the mysteries is an eloquent answer to an accusation of atheism at large or of popular folly. Mythology is the imperishable book in which nature has written in indelible characters a priceless record, the history of mankind on the little planet Earth. The ancients knew it so well that they gave manifold meanings to their symbolical gods and wrapped their sacred writings with such an impenetrable veil of mystery that they remained sealed books to the ignorant people, and will remain so for many years to come. In the lesser mysteries, all that was historical and interpretative was communicated to the neophytes, but the greater mysteries were reserved for those whose spiritual unfoldment entitled them to the knowledge of truth and the secret workings of nature. From the Egyptians down to the Jews, the correct measure of time was considered such a great secret that to reveal it to uninitiated persons was considered as a most heinous sin. Moreover, the Hebrews taught that to divulge the rabbinical mysteries to any outsider or impart to them the secrets contained in the Kabbalah was like eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It was punishable by death. How then can the Christian gospel teachers pretend to explain the Bible to small children? It seems almost too ludicrous to be believed when one knows that without the key to it, the Old Testament is incomprehensible. The sacred books of all the ancient nations require another book to be interpreted by, and as the Hebrews concealed the key to their holy scriptures in the Kabbalah, the Hindus hid the one to their Vedas in the Upanishads. Cowell has remarked very pertinently that the Upanishads breathe an entirely different spirit from other Brahmanical writings. They bear an expression of thought unknown in any earlier work, except the Rig Veda hymns. When truly interpreted, the Vedas, the Zend Avesta, and the Jewish Bible will revolutionize the world. They will be the death of those false theologies built upon ignorance and falsification. They were unwittingly the cause of the evil. In their true interpretation lies the remedy. Read by the light of the Zohar, the initial 4 chapters of Genesis, which have been criticized so severely, become a highly philosophical fragment in the history of the world's cosmogony, and agree thoroughly with the records kept by many other nations and on other continents, i.e. America. The Pentateuch is a collection of allegorical legends, not always a suitable reading for youth. In their symbolical garb, they are a myth, a nursery tale, a monstrous attempt to play havoc with science and logic, an evident effect of the spite of Jehovah's followers. To have let them serve as a prologue to Christianity was the greatest error committed by the early fathers of the Church, who knew very well what the Pentateuch meant and who appropriated it against the wishes of the rabbis. The latter exercised the severest vengeance by allowing the Christians to remain in possession of the dead letter, while they kept the secret meaning to themselves. Christianity, however, is not connected so absolutely with the Jewish religion as to owe it its existence. On the contrary, many of the shrewder advocates of the present system have expressed frequently their desire that the two doctrines should be considered independent of each other. The law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ, says John. And then again, all that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, quoting Christ's own words to his apostles when referring to the old dispensation. We agree with the apostles' last sentence, so we will proceed to consider if the New Testament can stand any more sifting down than Judaism. It has been asserted frequently that Jesus belonged to a sect called Essenes, Matthew 2:23. That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, he shall be called a Nazarene, that is a therapeut, Epiphanius. Eusebius, an early church father of great authority among Christians, claims that the monastic life was derived from the Essenes, and Epiphanius asserts that the Nazarenes and the Nazarites of the Old Testament were members of the same sect. We read in Basnage's Histoire des Juifs, Matthew 2:23, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. That is, as we see from Epiphanius, a therapeut. It is certain that none of the Jewish prophets had so said. Some other equally sacred writings are referred to, though their accomplishment by the mere resemblance of the name of the city in which Jesus is said to have resided to that of the order of monks to which he was believed to have belonged is a most miserable pun. The Jews, however, who think it reasonable to admit that such a person as Jesus really existed, place his birth nearly a century sooner than the generally assumed epoch. The word era is derived from the 4 initial letters of the formula ab exordio regni Augusti, which means from the beginning of the reign of Augustus. And for several centuries after the establishment of Christianity, nations continued to reckon from the starting point they had adopted, evincing the greatest indifference as to the year in which Jesus Christ was born. A very obscure monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus, or the Little, calculated by the means of chronological tables the year of the birth of Jesus Christ. He lived in the year 580 at Rome, but his contemporaries paid little attention to his discovery, and it was only 2 centuries afterwards that the Venerable Bede exhorted the Christians to adopt it, and Carlos Magnus in 800 issued an edict legalizing it. We read in the Acts that the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch, and the learned Jesuit Nicholas Serrarius contends that the first Christian monks were Essenes. Anyhow, it cannot be denied that the most eminent fathers of the Church had been educated and trained in the University of Alexandria. Furthermore, the most valued manuscripts of the New Testament are Codices Alexandrini. Here it becomes necessary to investigate the character and origin of that most remarkable set of men, the Essenes, on account of the prominent part they played in the origination and production of the Christian scriptures. The most celebrated writers of antiquity, such as Philo, Josephus, Pliny, and Solinus, have mentioned them frequently under the name of therapeutes or Essenes, which means the same thing, the only difference being that Essene is an Egyptian word, and therapeutai is Greek, but they are synonymous with surgeons, healers, and curates. It was in Egypt, says the great ecclesiastical historian Mosheim, that the morose discipline of asceticism took its rise, and it is observable that that country has, in all times as it were, by an immutable law or disposition of nature, abounded with persons of a melancholy complexion, and produced, in proportion to its extent, more gloomy spirits than any other parts of the world. It was here that the Essenes dwelt principally, long before the coming of Christ. Volume 1, page 196. Quoting the same author, Reverend Robert Taylor says, "It is not the first glance nor cursory observance that will sufficiently admonish the reader of the immense historical wealth put into his hand by this stupendous admission, this surrender of the keystone of the mighty arch, this giving up of everything that can be pretended for the evidences of the Christian religion." This admission of the great ecclesiastical historian, than whom there is no greater, will serve us as the Pythagorean theorem, the great geometrical element of all subsequent science, of continued recurrence, of infinite application, ever to be borne in mind, always to be brought in proof, presenting the means of solving every difficulty and the clue for guiding us to every truth. Bind it about thy neck, write it upon the tablet of thy heart. Everything of Christianity is of Egyptian origin. The therapeutes, or Essenes, are also recognized by that great pillar of the Church, the famous historian Eusebius, who acknowledges them as Christians, and who declares most emphatically that their ancient writings were our own Gospels and epistles. After such a confession, no argument would be of any avail if we prove once for all how the Christian world became possessed of the New Testament. In the year 327 AD, the Grand Council of Nice in Bithynia took place under the presidency of Constantine the Great. Pappus, in his Syndicon to the same council, affirms that, having placed all the sacred books under the altar in a church, the fathers besought the Lord that during the night the inspired writings might get upon the altar, and the spurious ones remain underneath. The next morning they repaired to the sacred edifice, and found on the altar our New Testament, or rather the books of which it is composed, and they rejected those that had remained underneath. The Romans used to have a maxim: the common people like to be deceived, let them be deceived, vulgus vult decipi, decipiatur. And so it has been with the Christian world at large. The immediate effect of the introduction of Christianity was absolutely disastrous. It seems as though man's understanding had collapsed entirely. A dark age was ushered upon the smoldering ashes of Grecian and Roman monuments. To a golden era wonderfully fertile in orators, philosophers, and artists, succeeded a generation of barbarians unable to understand the genius that guided their more highly gifted predecessors. Neither did virtue reign. From the beginning, the Church Fathers and even the Apostles deplore the corruption that is infecting all ranks. Were a wise man, says Bishop Kidder, to choose his religion by the lives of those who profess it, perhaps Christianity would be the last religion he would choose. The reason lies in the system adopted by the philosophical schools and theological teachers, that there are many truths which it is useless for the vulgar to know. Strabo shows at great length the general use of double meaning in theogony and sacred writings and their important effects. Euripides maintained that in the early state of society, wise men insisted on the necessity of darkening truth and persuading men of the existence of an ever-present immortal deity who hears, sees, and understands our actions, though we may think differently ourselves. The most distinguished legislators of antiquity were ardent advocates of that system, which we find underlying every religious doctrine of prehistoric races. It is illustrated in the legends and traditions of the ancient Central American races, in the Chaldean tablets, in the Greek mythology, in the Egyptian papyrus, in the Druidic dolmen, in the Parsee and Hindu sacred books. No wonder that the Bible is written in the same spirit. and is so misconstrued in spite of all the warnings repeated so frequently. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. Matthew 13:10. Surely here and in innumerable passages to the same effect, we find the mystical sense system of the therapeutes fully exemplified, and the same allegorical method of expounding their scriptures, so characteristic of the Egyptian monks, we find thoroughly adopted by Paul in his epistle to the Galatians, chapter 4. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory, for these are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. We could quote extensively to illustrate a fact establishing the irrefutable evidence of the Egyptian origin of all that is called Christian. Even the sacraments were patched up in the vacuum left by the deserted mysteries. During the 2nd century after the introduction of Christianity, the Church Fathers, being well aware of the deep respect entertained by Greeks and Romans alike for their mysteries, resolved to give to their religion the same seal of mysticism, with the hope of putting the pagan and Christian creeds on the same footing. They instituted sacraments, plagiarizing from the heathen not only the terms but even the empty rites of the desecrated mysteries, and adorning with pompous formulas and solemn titles ceremonies which to the ignorant masses soon became a meaningless superstition. They adopted also the Oriental method of teaching their religion with symbols, images, signs, and even actions, which in course of time lost entirely their original significance. The chasm which separated paganism from Christianity has been bridged over again by erudition. Science has reunited all the races that lived on this little planet Earth by establishing the irrefutable fact of the common origin of all religions, thus proving that they were all derived from the same archaic source. When symbology will be well understood, no intelligent man will meddle with the belief or unbelief of anyone. The early Christian fathers carried so far the principles of a double sense in Holy Writ, that they did not hesitate to declare that the Gospels were not truth according to the literal reading. There are things contained therein, says Origen, which taken in their literal sense are mere falsities and lies. St. Gregory in the same vein asserts that the whole divine letter is not only dead, but deadly. St. Anastasius declares that, should we understand the sacred scriptures according to the letter, we would fall into the most enormous blasphemies. And again we find, God also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter killeth. St. Paul. In the Kabbalah, secrecy is enforced in the most vehement terms. Now, exclaims the author of the Lesser Holy Assembly, we have said that this is a symbol. Whosoever revealeth arcana with fixed purpose of mind, he is not of the body of the most holy King. And whensoever his soul departeth, the same adhereth not unto the body of the King, for it is not his place. Woe unto that man, woe unto himself, woe unto his neshama. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.